Welcome to lesson 3, where we're going to look at pattern schematics. Now, pattern schematics often show up on those first few pages of a pattern, or they're kind of held off and put at the end of a pattern. They look a lot like a sketch of a sweater with measurements attached either to the sketch itself or to a table that might be directly under the image. Now, many contemporary patterns include these schematics, and we'll spend a lot of time in this lesson talking about how to use that schematic that you're given. But not all patterns have schematics, including some vintage patterns. So part of this lesson will be to think about what to do if you're not given a schematic. So once again, let's go back to the Triscow pattern, which includes the schematic on page 8, so at the end of the pattern. On the screen in front of you, I've put up a doctored version of the schematic that includes both centimeters and inches, so that when we're talking about this pattern, it's easier for us to kind of go between the two measurement systems. And the first thing I'd like to do is just talk through what we're actually seeing here before we dive into any of the particular numbers. At the top of the page, you see a sketch of the sweater that gives you a sense that it's a raglan construction, represented by those two lines coming down from the neck to the armpit. Now, written onto the sketch are the letters A, B, C, and D. And the arrows associated with those letters show you what part of the sweater is being measured. So, for example, the letter A represents the circumference of the main body of the sweater, both at the hemline and at the bust. The letter B represents the length of the sweater from hem to underarm. Letter C represents the length of the sleeve from cuff to underarm or underarm to cuff. And the letter D represents the circumference of the arm, or as it's written in the pattern, or the table below, the arm size. Now, some schematics are going to have more or less information, and many numbers of letters and numbers, and if you wanted to add more information to a schematic, you could always do that, especially if you know your gauge and you have a sense from reading the pattern what the relative measurements might be. You might also want to jot down your own measurements on a schematic so that you can get a sense of where you might need to modify things. At the bottom of the page, you see a table representing the different sizes of the pattern and how they relate to things like bust circumference, body length from underarm, sleeve length from underarm, and arm size, otherwise known as A, B, C, and D, as we've seen. Now, as a knitter, you can learn a lot from a schematic. For instance, this schematic tells us that the bust size that we're given at the beginning of the pattern is actually the same as the hem circumference. This implies that there's no shaping in the pattern. The body is going to be straight. There's no hourglass shaping where you're decreasing in and then increasing back out for the hips. There's no A-line shaping where you're going from one bust size to a larger hip size. From the table below the sketch, you can also learn that no matter the size of the body, the length of the sweater from the underarms to the hem is the same, according to the designer's idea of what the garment should look like. You also know that the sleeve length doesn't change whether or not you're knitting a size 32 or a size 62 in the garment. These are both good things to note about the pattern before you begin knitting, just in case you wanted to knit, say, a longer body or a longer sleeve. In each case, you would need more yarn and you need to plan for more rows or rounds to complete the sweater or the sleeve. One last thing to note here is that the actual bust circumference, or the measurement under the A column, differs slightly, just so slightly, from the sizing measurement that you're given. So for example, the size 80 centimeters it actually measures out to 81 centimeters, and the 130 centimeter size actually measures in at 129.5. In this case, those variations don't make a huge difference, but there may be patterns where the sizing and the actual mathematical circumference or length of a part of the garment differ more substantially. So it's nice to be able to have the intel to figure that kind of thing out. Now that we've had a look at the schematic and considered what information it contains, we can ask ourselves whether or not there are any surprises. I'm a little surprised, for example, to see that the body length from underarm to hem is the same for a size 80 centimeters to a size 158 centimeters. If I were knitting the larger size and wanted to maintain the style and proportion of the garment on a larger bust, I might want to plan on a slightly longer garment. This is not because a cropped sweater doesn't look good on a larger bust size. It's just a proportion thing. And that's because if you have a larger bust, a lot of fabric goes into covering the bust, and then you're left with an even more cropped sweater. So if you wanted to maintain the same style of crop or place of crop, you'd want to have a little bit more fabric in your garment. But again, that's up to the knitter and the style and fit that you're looking for. I think in general, it's important to note that if you're looking at other schematics and other patterns, you might find overall that standard sizing doesn't match your body. And I think this is true for most people in one respect or another. Standard sizing guides are often used by designers to grade their patterns, and those sizing guides are getting more inclusive. But those standard sizes for things like arm circumference or neck width or body length are based on averages, and they don't correspond to each of our unique bodies. That's one of the reasons why I like looking at a schematic, and it can be really helpful because it will reveal what the designer's assumptions are about different bodies and different measurements at different sizes. Schematics can also reveal how a pattern was graded or sized. Now the Tresckow pattern was graded really nicely in 2-inch or 5-centimeter increments, which provides a really wonderful range of sizes. Most knitters would be able to find a size close to their bust measurement without being in between sizes, for example. So one little schematic can provide us with a world of information about the designer's sizing, about what we can expect in terms of applying gauge to a pattern, and where we might be thinking about wanting to modify the sweater to make it fit our bodies a little bit better. In the last part of the lesson, I'd like to talk about what to do if there's not a schematic included in your pattern. First, don't panic if there's not a schematic, especially if you understand gauge and how to read the rest of the pattern, which we'll get to in the next lesson. Second, you might consider the source. Some free garment patterns don't have schematics, and we know a lot of vintage patterns don't have schematics. If you're going to work with either of these types of patterns, you'll probably need to plan for a little more figuring, mathematically speaking, before you begin knitting. So let's take a look at a few examples and talk about strategies. First, let's look at a vintage pattern from Reynolds. This pink champagne pullover takes up all of maybe 2 columns in the magazine, and much of the general information, that overview section, and abbreviations, are given en masse at the introduction to the entire collection, so they apply to the entire collection. Now, at first glance, it seems like there's not a whole lot of information included in this pattern, and if you are a beginning knitter, you might think, wow, this is only for experts who already know how to knit and have knit many sweaters. And sometimes that is true. You have to have some experience to knit some of these patterns that don't provide you as much information. But if you look closely, you'll notice that there is some information about the designer's expectations for sizing under the gauge bullet point. At the very bottom, you'll see something called blocking measurements. And that tells you that the sizes from the beginning of the pattern, which were given as 12, 14, 16, and 18, correspond to bust sizes of 34, 36, 38, and 40 inches. The pattern also provides measurements for the width of the back or front at the underarm and the width of the sleeves at the underarm. Now, granted, that's not a lot of information, but it does give you some sense of the designer's expectations and the expectations of the era in which the pattern was published. This is clearly not a size-inclusive pattern, for example, as it only goes from a size 34-inch bust up to a 40-inch bust. And like a lot of vintage patterns, this pink champagne pullover expects that you will have some familiarity with garment construction. If you really wanted to dig into this pattern, you could learn a lot more about the specifications of the garment, the length of the sleeves, the armhole depth, or even the neck width. But you'd need to come armed with your gauge and be ready to look at stitch counts to determine the actual measurements that are going on in this garment. The takeaway here is that even vintage patterns have more information than first meets the eye, but you have to dig just a little bit to try to find it. Next, let's look at the Le Pouf sweater by Beata Jezik of Hedgehog Fibers. This is a beautiful marled pullover that would look great in a variety of variegated yarn. And for a free pattern, this one includes an amazing amount of information about how to achieve that fade effect that you might have to pay for in a different kind of pattern. Now, I think this kind of extra instruction is something to really look for if you're wanting to try out a new garment technique. Find a pattern that gives you that extra instruction built in. Now you'll notice that there's not a schematic followed by a table of measurements, as we saw in the Tresckow pattern, but there is a section about measurements on page 5. And here we can see that it's a size-inclusive pattern that goes from a 28-inch bust up to a 62-inch bust, and it's been graded in roughly 2-inch increments. We can also see that the garment is intended to be worn with 2 to 5 inches of positive ease, which is not built into the sizing. So we'd want to pick a size that would provide that ease in addition to our regular measurement. So for example, one more time, someone with a 38-inch bust would likely want to knit a size, say, 41. We're also given things like back width and arm circumference in the table below the measurements subheading. And finally, we're told that the length for all the sizes is expected to be 18 inches from underarm to hem, but that this can be adjusted depending on your preference. So even without a sketch, all of this measurement information is really helpful as you plan your LaPouf sweater. For example, it gives you a sense of what the designer's expectations were in terms of sizing and measurement. And even without an actual sketch of the sweater, if you know what you're looking for in terms of what you could get out of a schematic, you can get a lot of the same information from this table of measurements. Finally, let's look at the Namu sweater by Knitboop. This free pattern is for a beautiful cabled pullover. You can actually download either the whole pattern, which includes sizes A through J, or you can download just the pattern specific to your size. I really love that feature of this particular pattern. I downloaded the full pattern that includes all the sizes, so I can show you a couple of things about this particular pattern. You'll notice if you look at the beginning or the end of the pattern, there's no schematic or sketch of the sweater, and there's not a table of measurements. However, there are a few places in this pattern where you can look to find measurement and sizing information. For example, on page 2, under Sizes and Yardage, the designer includes sizes A through J and gives you a chest measurement for each in both inches and centimeters. And throughout the pattern, she generally provides measurements in inches for lengths, as opposed to just providing row counts. So if you really wanted to create a schematic for your size, you could go through the pattern and compile these different measurements on a table or draw them out on a sketch. One of the reasons I wanted to discuss this pattern is because it's a good opportunity to think about your row gauge and how it applies to sweater knitting and sweater measurements. For example, if you read the body section on page 8, you learn that once you've reached the underarms, because this is a top-down sweater, you're going to work the charted instructions a number of times depending on your size. If you're going to work the smallest size, you would work 44 rows of the chart and then an additional 14 rows. Added together, this amounts to 58 rows altogether. Now we know from the pattern overview that the gauge in stockinette is 22 rows for 4 inches, which comes out to about 5.5 rows per inch. The cable gauge, of course, will be a bit different because cables tend to scrunch up and then relax when they're washed, but this gives us a ballpark figure to kind of mess around with. Once we know row gauge and the number of rows we'll be working, we can determine length. Through some simple math, we can figure out that if we are working 58 rows, then the length from the underarm to the top of the hem, if it were in stockinette, would be 10.5 inches, and that the ribbing will add another 1.75 inches for a total of 12.25 inches. Now, as the designer notes, if you think that you'd like a longer sweater, you can continue in pattern or create a longer hem. Now that's a good ballpark figure to have from underarm to the bottom of the hem of the sweater, but keep in mind that although the back is knit in stockinette, the front is knit in cable, so there's going to be a little bit of a scrunch and relax going on there. So you might want to lengthen the sweater depending on your ideal length from underarm to hem. Now because this is a top-down sweater, you also have the advantage of being able to try it on as you go. In these types of patterns, knowing the length of the body ahead of time is not always as crucial because you can always add a few more rounds or rows to the body of the sweater once you pull it on and see where it's hitting your hips or wherever the bottom of the sweater is supposed to be. Knowing the length of the body ahead of time would matter much more if you were working on a bottom-up sweater because it's much more difficult to try those sweaters on as you knit. So the take home here is that even if you don't have a schematic, there are lots of ways to find information about measurement in a pattern. You just have to know where to look and how to do a little bit of sweater math. I hope this tour through pattern schematics has given you the confidence to dig a little further into your pattern to understand measurements and designer expectations about sizing. In the next lesson, we'll be applying everything that we've been learning so far, from the overview, the gauge, and the schematic, to the main body of the pattern.